50% tariffs, roughly $20 billion in Canadian goods, retaliatory tariffs coming from Ottawa, and now another 50% tariff threat on Canadian automobiles and parts from January 2027.
Canada says within hours it will unveil how it will further respond after Donald Trump slapped a new 50% tariff on the nation's auto industry from next year. But can the Canadians actually fight back in a trade war with the US?
This isn't simply another dispute between Washington and Ottawa. It could become a test of something much bigger. How predictable are global trade rules when economic power becomes a negotiating weapon? Because if the United States and Canada, two deeply integrated economies, can move from negotiation to escalation this quickly, businesses everywhere need to rethink what trade certainty really means. Hi, this is Indranil and welcome to the Spotlight Media and Technology. Today, we are breaking down the latest US-Canada trade escalation, the numbers behind it, and why this matters not just to American and Canadian, but to entrepreneurs, investors, and companies around the world. And importantly, we are looking at this through an ESG governance and business risk lens.
The Trump administration is discussing additional trade measures against Canada after Prime Minister Mark Carney unveiled dollar-for-dollar retaliation to new tariffs imposed by the US on Saturday.
Canada imposed retaliatory tariffs against the United States today as the two neighbors slide toward an all-out trade war.
The tariffs will hit a range of US products from industrial goods to everyday items. At the same time, President Trump is threatening Canada with even steeper tariffs.
Let's start with the facts. After weeks of negotiations, the United States and Canada failed to reach a trade agreement. The result: the United States moved ahead with 50% tariffs on roughly $20 billion worth of Canadian products, covering more than 550 products according to reporting based on the tariff action. The products range from hockey sticks and honey to textiles, paper products, electronics, and other consumer goods. And the legal mechanism is significant. The tariffs are being imposed under Section 338 of a US Tariff Act 1930, a provision that allows the President to impose duties of up to 50% when foreign discrimination or unequal treatment is determined to disadvantage US commerce. That matters because this isn't simply a conventional tariff negotiation. It represents the use of a very old US trade authority in a very modern geopolitical environment. Canada has responded with a dollar-for-dollar retaliation strategy, with countermeasures scheduled to begin September 8.
The goal of our trade negotiations with the United States has always been to get the best deal for Canadians, never a deal at any price or on any time frame. The best deal. Le meilleur accord pour les travailleurs, les familles du Québec. Well, we did make some progress in recent weeks. In the end, that momentum reversed, and we could not accept what the US had offered, nor could we give what they asked. And by standing up for our values and focusing on what we can control, we will build un Québec fort in Canada fort pour tout.
Targeting areas including US steel, dairy, electronics, and agricultural equipment. And here's the bigger number. According to US Census Bureau data, US-Canada goods trade reached approximately $376 billion in the first 6 months of 2026. So the $20 billion directly affected by this latest tariff round is relatively small compared with the overall relationship. But the precedent could be enormous. And there is another escalation investors need to watch. On August 24, President Trump threatened 50% tariffs on Canadian automobiles, trucks, and auto parts beginning January 1, 2027. That is much more consequential because North America's automobile industry operates through deeply integrated cross-border supply chains. Now let's bring this home for the American business community. A tariff is often described as a tax on imports because economically the question is, who ultimately absorbs the cost? It can be the foreign producers, it can be the American importer, it can be the retailers, or it can eventually show up in the price paid by the American consumer. And when supply chains are highly integrated, the answer isn't always simple. Consider automobiles. A component can cross the US-Canada border multiple times before a finished vehicle reaches a customer. So when governments impose tariffs on individual stages of that supply chain, the impact isn't necessarily confined to the country. It can increase input cost, inventory requirements, working capital pressure, and pricing uncertainty. For a large corporation, that may be manageable. For a small manufacturer or entrepreneur operating on a 5% margin, that is a very different story. And this is where the trade war becomes a business resilience issue. So why should an entrepreneur in Texas cares about a Canadian tariff? And why should an exporter in India, Germany, or in the UAE be watching? Because the real issue is predictability. For decades, companies built international supply chains around trade agreements, tariff-scheduled rules of origin, and relatively stable regulatory expectations. USMCA was supposed to provide exactly that kind of framework across North America. But in 2026, the agreement itself is under review. The United States decided not to simply renew USMCA on schedule while keeping the agreement in effect as negotiations continue. At the same time, Washington has been conducting bilateral negotiations with Mexico covering automobile, steel and aluminium, agriculture, labor, economic security, and rules of origin. That creates an important signal for global business. Trade agreements are no longer something companies can treat as permanent background infrastructure. They are becoming an active component of strategic risk management, and this is where the Spotlight Media and Technology takes a clear position. We believe this is fundamentally a governance story, not because tariffs are inherently good or bad. Governments have legitimate reasons to protect strategic industries, address trade barriers, and strengthen domestic manufacturing. And the United States has explicitly framed these measures around concerns about discriminatory treatment and US economic interest. But from a corporate governance perspective, businesses need something governments don't always have: long-term predictability. A company making a 5-year investment decisions need to know what its supply chain could look like 3 years from now. A manufacturer needs confidence about sourcing, and investors need confidence about regulatory exposure, and a board needs to understand how geopolitical decisions can affect revenue, margins, capital expenditure, and enterprise value. That's why we believe trade policy risk belong inside enterprise risk management, not in a footnote. Not only in the geopolitical section of an annual report, and certainly not as something management looks at after a tariff announcement. It belongs alongside cybersecurity, climate transition, regulatory and supply chain risk, because ultimately resilience is an ESG issue. So what should entrepreneurs and business leaders actually do? Number 1. Map your exposure. Don't just identify your direct suppliers. Identify where your critical components, raw materials, and logistics routes originate. Number 2. Reduce concentration risk. One supplier, one country, one export market, one trade agreement, they may all look efficient until the rules change. Number 3. Build scenarios, not predictions. Don't try to predict exactly what Washington or Ottawa will do next. Instead, model what happens if tariffs rise, what happens if retaliation expands, what happens if a key component becomes 20% more expensive, and what happens if your largest export market becomes less accessible. That's strategic resilience. 3 dates and developments deserve attention. First, September 8. Canada's announced retaliatory measures are scheduled to begin. Second, January 1, 2027. That's when the threatened 50% US tariff on Canadian automobiles, trucks, and parts could take effect. And third, the future of USMCA. Because the question isn't simply whether the United States, Canada, and Mexico reach another agreement. The bigger question is, what kind of trade framework will North America operate under next? A predictable regional system, or a series of bilateral negotiations where market access increasingly becomes a bargaining tool? That distinction matters enormously for global investors. Now, I want to hear from you. If you are an entrepreneur or business leader in the United States, would you rather pay a little more for a diversified supply chain or accept lower cost with greater geopolitical risk? And if you are watching from outside North America, has the US-Canada trade war changed the way you think about doing business with the United States? Tell us in the comment section, and tell us which country you are watching from, because this isn't just a North America conversation. It's a conversation about the future of global trade. This is Indranil, and this is the Spotlight Beyond Profession, Beyond Headlines, Beyond Borders. Subscribe, share this video with a business leader who needs to see it, and stay with us as we track where North American trade goes next. If you are navigating trade policy risk, supply chain resilience, or ESG strategy at your organization, we help companies with ESG strategy and communication. Link in the description. See you in the next one. Thank you very much for watching and signing it off.